What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another video. Thank you so much for watching. Today we are going to be reviewing Hob, the new indie title from the developers of Torchlight. If you do enjoy, like and subscribe and we'll get straight into it. So, Hob, the Greenpeace take on the T-Virus, a jigsaw planet, machines that don't seem to quite know what's going on, and a generally beautiful experience. First up, we're going to tackle graphics and visuals. So, this is where it's a bit strange for me. I've played a few indie games, maybe half a dozen popular indie games. I don't try the more out there ones in general. But the graphic style in Hob is beautiful. The art style they've gone for is gorgeous. Don't get me wrong. But this whole sort of very colourful, blocky style of colouring and the blocky style of shading and outlining everything with a dark line to give it like a cel-shaded look and to really bring things forward isn't something that's completely new within games anymore. Games have been doing it for a while, and while the graphics can be likened to some of the Zelda games, maybe Firewatch as well, and a few others, it's not particularly unique. Having said that, even though its graphic style doesn't have the most identity that it could have done, what Hob does do very well, it does terrifically. There is not something bad that I can say about the art style in this game. There are maybe 4 or 5 different areas and different sort of environments that you will be in, from grass to water to caves to like a sort of barren desert-y sort of wasteland, and then a steady mix of the in-between with the Greenpeace version of the T-Virus taking over. And all the colour palettes and all of the environmental design choices stand out really nicely here. A lot of the level design in Hob has metal strewn about because it is supposed to be, as far as I'm aware, a machine planet. And while a lot of games will make the mistake of making this metal far too pronounced and far too red and not very attractive to look at, Hob does the other thing and makes it bronze and copper and brass sort of colouring. That sort of orange tint, and it does look very nice and sits very nicely with the greens and the purples that you will find lying around. Later on when you get in the game, you do encounter water puzzles and levels, and that looks terrific. I will give it credit where it's due, it looks absolutely terrific. Up there with some of the best watery graphics that I've seen in indie games. It does look very, very nice. So while Hob might not have the most unique graphics and the most unique art style, it does it very, very well. Possibly better than any of the competition currently around right now, with maybe the exception of Rhyme. And it's not just the art style that's really nice either. The animations as a whole are very, very good. Your main character has this sort of lope, this gait, as he's walking, because he's got this big rock fist hanging off one arm, and it looks really nice. He's sort of dragging it behind him. Combat animations are also very good. The dodging, the rolling, the blocking, and the special abilities all look very nice and don't look out of place in the world at all. The animations when the world does move around in its puzzle-like layout looks really nice, and everything fits. There isn't a single time where I thought, well, that doesn't look like it belongs here, which does happen with some of the cheaper games, as this game is only £16. So overall, visuals are very nice, animations are strong, art style is strong, maybe not as individual as it could have been. They could have been a bit bolder with their art style choices, but everything does look quite nice. Now, I was playing this game, or am playing this game, on a GTX 1060 6GB with an i7 7700 clocked at 3.6 GHz. I am also playing at 144Hz on a G-Sync display, so things like frame drops and stutters don't particularly affect me. And if you're not running an adaptive sync monitor, I do think you're going to have some troubles with Hob. Now, most of the time on high and ultra graphics, Hob was sitting at a very rock solid 140 to 160 frames per second. But then the way the camera moves in Hob, which is very good for the most part, by the way, the camera is very contextual based. So as you move into an area, it might pan out to show you more of the area. It might pan down to show you a vista. It might even pan side to side, depending on where you are, whether you're in a tunnel or you need more low-level visibility. And when the camera does pan like this to bring more stuff into view, the frame rate, more often than not, will tank. And I mean that as well. On my PC, you would call a relatively high-level PC, but when it did one of these panning vistas, my Hob would drop from 140 frames per second down to like 90 or 80 occasionally. If you're running an adaptive sync display, whether that be AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync, you're going to be fine because you're not going to notice those frame drops. If you're not, however, you're going to struggle at times to maintain that strong frame rate on high settings. Having said that as well, I had it quite badly a couple of times. The worst that I can remember was dropping from, I think it was like 145, 146, all the way down to 18 frames per second. And that's sort of, in a game that is an indie game, that is a cheap game, but a game that looks this nice, you want the frame rates to hold up. And you don't want to have to sacrifice down to medium graphics if it's just a £16 indie game. It's weird, because on a game like The Witcher, for instance, you kind of expect that you're not going to be able to play out on Ultra. But because this is an indie game, and because it's really not loading in a lot at the time, to have the frame rates tank that much is really strange. It could just be that it needs a patch. It could just be that Nvidia 10 series cards don't quite work properly with it at the moment, for whatever reason. But the frame rate did tank more often than not, and if it stays that way and you're not running an adaptive sync display, you're going to have some major issues with frame drops. It happened a few times in combat. If I was fighting more than one enemy, it would tank down to sort of 60-70 frames per second, which obviously is still pretty good. But if you were at 130, you're going to get some major screen stutter, so just bear that in mind if you do plan on purchasing this title. Overall, graphics are very nice. Art style could have been more original and individual, but everything fits really nicely, and it does get, for the most part, top marks from me. Next up, we're going to talk about audio. Now, the audio on Hob is good. It is good, there's no doubt about it. The combat sounds are satisfying. The enemy sounds do sound, they're individual, you can tell what's there and what's not, even before they come onto screen. The environmental sounds are very nice, and the music, when there is any, is also very well done and very poignant. Now, having said all that, I think Hob could have done more on the audio front. What is there on a regular basis does sound very nice, and the sort of surround sound left and right sounds really nice as well, depending on what sort of areas you're in. You can tell that the sound does change. But the most sound you're going to hear on a regular basis is the wind and the sound of whatever you're fighting. And I feel like in an indie game, it's quite often made or sold on its soundtrack. Games like Firewatch and Rime were sort of almost made on their soundtrack, and the fact that there really isn't one in Hob seems like an odd choice, because it's an action-adventure, platformer, puzzler, with RPG side elements, and it looks incredible, and that would be accompanied really nicely by some just chilled out, laid back music. But there isn't really any music at all, and there certainly isn't voice acting, because this game is advertised as a voiceless game. The only voices there are the screams of the enemies that you are killing, and the occasional gasp or scream from yourself. And overall, audio is very nice, don't get me wrong, it's very situational, it works very well with the world, but there definitely could have been more. I would have loved to have some more epic soundtracks, and there is a soundtrack there. When something happens that is important, it is accompanied by a soundtrack, but it just doesn't happen often enough, and I did found that missing occasionally, because there are moments in Hob where you're going to be running around looking for where you're supposed to be going and solving things, and all you've got in your ear is the wind. And the wind, oddly enough, sounds very, very good. It sounds very realistic, sounds really nice, really calming, but often at times it was so loud, and I feel like music just would have been a better choice to fill these gaps. And I can understand in an indie game why you don't go with voice actors. Voice actors add a extra amount onto your budget, and I wouldn't have wanted them to put voice acting in this and sacrifice anything else, because for the most part Hob is a terrific package. But with no voice acting, a very sparse soundtrack, you have to wonder what they're giving you on a soundtrack basis, and that's where you come to the environmental sounds of Hob. I've already discussed the wind, but the wind, the swimming, jumping and leaping, the sound of the ground moving away, just the sound of your fist grinding against it, the knuckles grinding against each other because your fist is made from rock when you're climbing something, all sounds so satisfying. I don't know, obviously, who mastered and produced the sounds of the rock and the machinery, but it sounds so good. It's almost like they got some high-tech, it's almost like they got some hi-fi equipment, stuck it in a room with some pebbles and just rubbed them around for a few hours to get some sound effects. And it does sound very good, and it's actually the saving grace of the soundtrack because it's quite engrossing. It really pulls you into the world when something does sound that good and that realistic. When you're moving things around, when you're pulling levers, pushing buttons and dragging things around the ground, and jumping, leaping and climbing, it all sounds very good. And it's weird because I wouldn't usually say, but that saved the audio, something like that, because it's something very little, very peripheral to the normal experience. But without a regular soundtrack and without any voice acting really to speak of, everything else in the game sounds really nice, and that is its saving grace, because audio could have been what brought this game down in my mind, but instead it actually sits very nicely against everything else. Overall, I wish there was more audio, but the audio that there is sounds incredible. Sounds so realistic and so well done, and very well mixed. There's a lot of depth and post-processing to some of these effects that you can hear and appreciate, and it sounds that much more high quality for it. And yeah, that's overall, audio's very good, but I wish there had been more of a soundtrack, unfortunately. So next up, we're going to touch on gameplay and a little bit about the story. Hob's gameplay is an interesting mix of action, adventure, RPG, with some, well, a lot of puzzler and platformer elements, and depending on how you play the game, it's either going to be more of a puzzler and a platformer, or more of an action RPG adventure game. That's a very long tag, but you understand what I mean in a minute. So Hob rolls around combat, puzzle solving, and climbing. Jumping, running, platforming in general, and all of those three things are done very, very well. The combat feels smooth, satisfying. It has elements of a Souls-like to it. Enemies do a hefty amount of damage, and combat is heavily reliant on blocking, dodging, and counter-attacking when necessary. Platforming feels really nice. Jumping mechanics can be really, really awkward on a keyboard and mouse. So if you, unless you're very good at platforming, I would recommend sticking to a controller. Any regular console goers going over to Steam to play this, if you have an Xbox like myself, for instance, I recommend using a controller because trying to navigate some of the jumps with arrows just doesn't quite work out. And the puzzling element feels really nice as well. It's really well done. It's not overly confusing. It's not self-explanatory, but it's also very natural and very organic in the way that it's done. So these three main elements are done really well. What isn't done quite so well is the other two bits, adventure, RPG. So the action is done well, the platforming is done well, the puzzling is done very well. But the adventure and the RPG segments are not done so well, and I'll explain why now. So the adventure part. So Hob is a game that's heavily based on exploration and finding your own way. The game doesn't tell you very much, it doesn't regularly tell you where to go. It tells you your destination on a regular basis, but not how to get there. That you need to largely figure out by yourself, and that's perfectly fine. And 80% of the time, Hob does this very well. It's very well explained, the contextual environment helps you a lot in figuring out where you've got to go, and the puzzles for the most part feel very organic and very natural. Unfortunately, there's no middle ground. When the game doesn't work like this, it is infuriating. If the game doesn't tell you where to go and it's not easy to figure out for yourself, the environment doesn't tell you, it's the most annoying thing I think I've ever experienced. And that is because of the way that Hob works fundamentally. There are going to be many routes for most of the game that are blocked off to you until you either find another way around or you get an ability that lets you through. And it's not always obvious exactly what you need to do to get through. And the world map is not particularly great at best. It shows you the routes, but it doesn't show you what is on those routes, as it were. There are no objective markers that tell you how to get where you're going, and there are no pointers of any kind for most of the game. And when these situations do crop up, I had it maybe 3 times in my playthrough where it was not obvious what I was supposed to be doing or where I was supposed to be going I would wander around for 25, 30 minutes just trying to figure out what to do next. And once I found it, I was back having a great time. But that 30 minutes was the most infuriated that I've been at a video game in a long time, honestly. And that really does kind of take away from the fun. And Hob is a long game as well. Hob is a long indie game. Coming in at by my judgment, I haven't quite finished it just yet. I'm coming up on the end now. It is about 8 to 9 hours long if you take your time, I think, judging by, unless I'm just slow. It could be that I'm just slow, but it's about 8 to 9 hours. And when these situations do crop up, you find yourself just wanting the game to finish. And that's not a good way to look at a game of any kind, really. Even worse so when it is an indie game and it is a platformer and you're supposed to be having fun doing the platforming. To wander around the same levels for about half an hour, backtracking to find out where you've got to go, just to find out that you didn't hack down the right tree to find out where you've got to be going, is annoying to say the least, and infuriating at its absolute worst. That's the adventure part, and that is the main downside of it, but you've also got the RPG part, which I feel like is not taken advantage of by the developers in what is a strong base system. Throughout the game, you will encounter schematics, I think they're called, for upgrading your character, adding new attacks, new movement abilities, and the such. And the ones that are given to you automatically are crucial to the game. These are called armaments. They basically buff your rock arm with different weapons and abilities to allow you to get around the world. That's all well and good. The optional ones, however, are borderline pointless. I can't recall any time where I felt like I needed any of the optional upgrades in combat. And that's a real shame because the optional upgrades are actually really fun. Now, those of you that are playing the game for the combat might actually purchase these upgrades, but I just didn't see the point. Towards the end of the game, once I knew where I was going and most of the routes were open, I was just running past most of the enemies that I could. If I needed to be in any area for any length of time, I would obviously kill off the surrounding enemies, but for the most part, I was just running past everyone. And these combat upgrades feel pointless. The workshop that you apply them in, I visited like 3 times throughout the entire 8 hours. And the game does a very good job of reminding you that it exists during loading screens, but I just didn't feel the need to use it, and I feel the RPG side of it was really, really underplayed for the most part. When you think of another indie game called Castle Crashers, which was a side-scrolling action game, they had RPG elements, and it worked really well. It felt necessary to upgrade your character. In Hob, it just doesn't, and that's a really unfortunate thing, because they could have done a lot more with the RPG thing in general. Now, back to what is good. The puzzling. The puzzling is so well thought out and so well designed. It's quite linear in the way it's done. It's quite obvious where you need to go most of the time and the puzzles that you need to solve in order to get there. But the puzzles, while not particularly challenging a lot of the time, are so ingenious from a developer point of view that they're really fun to watch unfold. You pull a lever and levels of, well, the level itself start rising and falling and presenting you with a new path to your objective. And watching this whole puzzle board world come together, seeing what's going on underneath. It does this thing where a plate will launch out of an abyss, hover above you for a few seconds so you can see what's going on the inside of the world, and then it will drop down and provide you with a route to your next objective. And it's just very, very well done. And whoever the main designer for these levels was, and there's usually a team, isn't there? They did a very, very good job because the puzzles are very fluid, very organic, and very satisfying to finish, even if they're not particularly challenging. If I had to pick holes in the puzzles at all, it would be that for the most part, most of them didn't take any brain power to figure out. But I don't think that's the point of Hob. I don't think it's supposed to be the Witness style puzzler where everything seems impossible. I think it's more just supposed to be puzzles for the sake of puzzles being fun. And that's what I really like about Hob. It tries its hardest to be fun in every situation. It really, really shines in the puzzling and the platforming as well. And you know what? They did a good job for the most part, even if I did moan for a few minutes there. So, I'm just going to tackle a little bit of the story because it is a bit of a weird one. Like most indie games, Hob doesn't offer you much for the story. A lot of it is left for you to figure out. And I did reference a Greenpeace version of the T-Virus, and that becomes relatively quickly the key objective of the game, ridding this world, this beautifully crafted world, of this virus that does seem to be encapsulating everything around it. And it's almost like plant life gone bad kind of thing. You've got all these green plants all at harmony with each other, and then you've got these big purple spiky blobby things blocking the path, and it does very well, I'd say very quickly, about halfway through the game, that becomes your main objective, clearing the world of this purple shit. And avoiding any more spoilers, the story is handled quite well. A lot of it is left for you to figure out what happened in the past, what's going to happen, what your objective is, who you are, and how many people tried to do what you did before you. And all of that is explained quite nicely through the visuals and collectibles that you do find through the game. There isn't much lore, there's no written lore at all. A lot of it you just have to figure out from suggestive level design, and it does work very, very well for the most part. In terms of your own character, there's no story to your character at all. There are obvious suggestions around the world that you were not the first to try and do what you were doing, but there's no sort of help whatsoever as to who you are. You are human, unlike the rest of the inhabitants on the planet, so they don't explain very well who you are, but they do a very good job of using the environment and using the puzzles and the platforming to explain what's going on with the world, what happened with the world previously, and how the world used to be. And they've done a very good job. Most indie games, a lot of indie games, Limbo being a good example, will have very, very good base game mechanics, very, very atmospheric game design, but not a very good job of explaining what is going on. And then you've got other indie games that are very story heavy. You know, your walking simulators. Story of Edith Finch, Firewatch, and a couple of others. Hob sits very nicely between the two. It doesn't tell you everything you might want to know, but it also lets you figure out anything you really want to know by yourself. And for the most part, the story and the progression of the story is handled very nicely throughout. So overall, what are my thoughts on Hob? Obviously, the graphics and the visuals are very nice, if not particularly imaginative. The audio is very nice, even if there's not a lot of it, and the gameplay and story hold up very nicely in tandem with each other. Is there any other major downsides to Hob? Not really. I feel like the length and the occasional frustrating level design and lack of information are the two major downsides to Hob. The other major downside is if you don't like other games in this indie genre that are similar to this, even slightly, you're not going to like Hob. There's nothing here that will bring you into loving these generously artistic indie games like Firewatch, Limbo, Inside, etc, etc, etc. If you don't like those anyway, Hob is not going to change your mind, and you probably won't enjoy it. But that's about it. Other than that, Hob is a terrific game. Very well made, very strong. Only a few, borderline no technical issues aside from the frame drop, and everything just holds together really, really nicely. So overall, a very good job from the creators of Torchlight. That's about it for the review though, guys. So all that's left to say, would I recommend you buy it? Would I recommend you wait? Or would I recommend that you don't bother? Basically, if you like indie games, and if you happen to like platformers and adventure games, play Hob. At £16, you're not going to regret it. I don't regret it, and these styles of games aren't something that I'm amazingly passionate about. So overall, I think you'll be very, very happy with the purchase. If you don't like indie games in general, Hob is not going to change your mind, and I suggest you avoid it. But for the asking price of £16, I do not see any problem in supporting developers like these in making more games in the future. Maybe it'll be Torchlight 3 for those that are clamouring for that. Anyway, guys, if you did enjoy, like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Hob, and if there's any games you'd like me to cover on Steam. But other than that, mine's been Zach. You've all been awesome, and peace.